we have gone live. How nice. Let me just make sure everything works, and then we'll get started. Okay. What do we got here? Checking the streams. Does it go? Does it go? All right, we're live. Yeah. Welcome to another reading stream. We're new. We've got a new book. Starting fresh. And the book we're going to start with is The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is a recommendation to me by many others and even an appendix for some tabletop game that you may or may not have heard of. So I thought, since we wrapped up Frankenstein and I'm kind of in between, I thought what better way to bring in the new year with a new book than with this book. Pretty simple. I have no idea what to expect from Lord Dunsany's work or what the contents are. I just have the recommendation and that's it. So, there's not a lot of preamble other than some other housekeeping that I may try to do voices. I may put some emphasis or spin on it, but I'm not really trying to perform. This isn't going to be an audiobook replacement. It's supposed to be just kind of an in-the-moment enjoying of the book, told verbally, and discussed at any point that comes up that is worth discussing or that is distracting enough. I know with Frankenstein, a lot of things that I had that stopped me up were the great prose. So, without further ado, I think it's time to get started. We're about 2 minutes in. The edition I'm reading, for reference, is this. What do we got? It's what edition? Ballantine Books edition. There are a few indie published ones that may have some issues, so just mileage varies and all that. Yeah, we'll put that up there. That's the edition that I'm reading from. So when I give page numbers, that's what's for reference. And if you want to read along, I highly suggest you read along. Let's get started here. We are starting with Chapter 1, The Plan of the Parliament of Earl. In their ruddy jackets of leather that reached to their knees, the men of Earl appeared before their lord, the stately white-haired man in his long red room. He leaned in his carven chair and heard their spokesman. And thus their spokesman said, "For 700 years the chiefs of your race have ruled us well, and their deeds are remembered by the minor minstrels, living on yet in their little tinkling songs. And yet the generations stream away, and there is no new thing." "What would you?" said the Lord. "We would be ruled by a magic lord," they said. "So be it," said the Lord. "It is 500 years since my people have spoken thus in Parliament, and it shall always be as your Parliament saith. You have spoken, so be it." And he raised his hand and blessed them, and they went. They went back to their ancient crafts, to the fitting of iron to the hooves of horses, to working upon leather, to tending flowers, to ministering to the rugged needs of earth. They followed the ancient ways and looked for a new thing. But the old lord sent a word to his eldest son, bidding him come before him. And very soon the young man stood before him in that same carven chair from which he had not moved, where light, growing late, from high windows, showed the aged eyes looking far into the future beyond that old lord's time. And seated there he gave his son his commandment. "Go forth," he said, "before these days of mine are over, and therefore go in haste, and go from here eastwards, and past the fields we know, till you see the lands that clearly pertain to Fairy, and cross their boundary, which is made of twilight, and come to that palace that is only told of in song." "It is far from here," said the young man Alveric. "Yes," answered he, "it is far." "And further still," the young man said, "to return, for distances in those fields are not as here." "Even so," said his father. "What do you bid me do," said the son, "when I come to that palace?" And his father said, "To wed the king of Elfland's daughter." The young man thought of her beauty and crown of ice, and the sweetness and that fabulous runes had told it was hers. Songs were sung of her on wild hills, where tiny strawberries grew at dusk and by early starlight. And if one sought the singer, no man was there. Sometimes only her name was sung softly over and over. Her name was Lyrazel. She was a princess of the magic line. The gods had sent their shadows to her christening, and the fairies too would have gone, but that they were frightened to see on their dewy fields the long, dark, moving shadows of the gods. So they stayed hidden in the crowds of pale pink anemones, and thence blessed Lyrazel. My people demand a magic lord to rule over them. They have chosen foolishly, the old lord said, and only the dark ones that show not their faces know all that this will bring, but we, who see not, follow the ancient custom and do what our people in their parliament say. It may be some spirit of wisdom they have not known may save them even yet. Go then with your face turned towards that light that beats from fairyland, and that faintly illumines the dusk between sunset and early stars, and this shall guide you till you come to the frontier and have passed the fields we know. Then he unbuckled a strap and a girdle of leather, and gave his huge sword to his son, saying, This, that has brought our family down the ages unto this day, shall surely guard you always upon your journey, even though you fare beyond the fields we know. And the young man took it, though he knew that no such sword could avail him. Near the castle of Earl there lived a lonely witch, on a high land near the thunder, which used to roll in summer along the hills. There she dwelt by herself, in a narrow cottage of thatch, and roamed the high fields alone to gather the thunderbolts. Of these thunderbolts that had no earthly forging were made, with suitable runes, such weapons as had to parry unearthly dangers. And alone would roam this witch at certain tides of spring, taking the form of a young girl in her beauty. Singing among tall flowers in the gardens of Earl, she would go at the hour when the hawk moths first passed from bell to bell. And of those few that had seen her was the son of the lord of Earl. And though it was calamity to love her, though it rapt men's thoughts away from all things true, yet the beauty of the form that was not hers had lured him to gaze at her with deep young eyes, till, whether flattery or pity moved her, who knows that is mortal, she spared him whom her arts might well have destroyed, and, changing instantly in that garden there, showed him the rightful form of a deadly witch. And even then his eyes did not at once forsake her, and in the moments that his glance still lingered upon that withered shape that haunted the hollyhocks he had her gratitude that may not be bought, nor won by any charms that the Christians know. And she had beckoned to him, and he had followed, and learned from her on her thunder-haunted hill that on the day of need a sword might be made of metals not sprung from earth, with runes along it that would waft away certainly any thrust of earthly sword, and except for 3 master runes could thwart the weapons of Elfland. As he took his father's sword, the young man thought of the witch. It was scarcely dark in the valley when he left the castle of Earl, and went so swiftly up the witch's hill that a dim light lingered yet on its highest heaths, when he came near the cottage of the one that he sought, and found her burning bones at a fire in the open. To her he said that the day of his need was come, and she bade him gather thunderbolts in her garden, in the soft earth under her cabbages. And there, with eyes that saw every minute more dimly, and fingers that grew accustomed to the thunderbolt's curious surfaces, he found before darkness came down on him 17, and these he heaped into a silken kerchief and carried back to the witch. On the grass beside her he laid those strangers to earth. From wonderful spaces they came to her magical garden, shaken by thunder from paths that we cannot tread, and though not in themselves containing magic, were well adapted to carry what magic her runes could give. She laid the thigh bone of a materialist down, and turned to those stormy wanderers. She arranged them in one straight row by the side of her fire, and over them she toppled the burning logs in the embers, prodding them down with the ebon stick that is the scepter of witches, until she had deeply covered those 17 cousins of earth that had visited us from their ethereal home. She stepped back then from her fire and stretched out her hands, and suddenly blasted it with a frightful rune. The flames leaped up in amazement, and what had been but a lonely fire in the night, with no more mystery than pertains to all such fires, flared suddenly into a thing that wanderers feared. As the green flames, stung by her runes, leaped up, and the heat of the fire grew intenser, she stepped backwards further and further, and merely uttered her runes a little louder the further she got from the fire. She bade Alvric pile on logs, dark logs of oak that lay there cumbering the heath, and at once As he dropped them on, the heat licked them up, and the witch went on pronouncing her louder runes, and the flames danced wild and green and down in the embers of the 17, whose paths had once crossed earth when they wandered free, knew heat again as great as they had known, even on that desperate ride that had brought them here, and when Alveric could no longer come near the fire, and the witch was some yards from it shouting her runes, the magical flames burned all the ashes away, and that portent that flared on the hill as suddenly ceased. And the portent that flared on the hill as suddenly ceased, leaving only a circle that sullenly glowed on the ground, like the evil pool that glares where a thermite has burst, and flat in the glow, all liquid still, lay the sword. The witch approached it and pared its edges with a sword that she drew from her thigh. Then she sat down beside it on the earth, and sang to it while it cooled. Not like the runes that enraged the flames was the song she sang to the sword. She whose curses had blasted the fire till it shriveled big logs of oak crooned, now a melody like a wind in the summer blowing from the wild wood gardens, that no man tended, down valleys loved once by children, now lost to them but for dreams. A song of such memories as lurk and hide along the edges of oblivion, now flashing from beautiful years a glimpse of some golden moment, now passing swiftly out of remembrance again, to go back to these shades of oblivion, and leaving on the mind those faintest traces of little shining feet, which when dimly perceived by us are called regrets. She sang of old summer noons, in the time of harebells. She sang on that high dark heath a song that seemed so full of mornings and evenings preserved with all their dews by their magical craft from days that had else been lost. That Elveric wondered of each small wandering wing that her fire had lured from the dusk, if this were the ghost of some day lost to man, called up by the force of her song from times that were fairer. And all the while the unearthly metal grew harder. The white liquid stiffened and turned red. The glow of the red dwindled, and as it cooled it narrowed. Little particles came together, little crevices closed, and as they closed they seized the air about them, and with the air they caught the witch's rune and gripped it and held it forever. And so it became a magical sword. And little magic there is in English woods, from the time of anemones to the falling of leaves, that was not in the sword. And little magic there is in the southern downs, that only sheep roam over in quiet shepherds, that the sword had not too. And there was the scent of thyme in it, and sight of lilac, and the chorus of birds that sing before dawn in April, and the deep proud splendor of rhododendrons, and the litheness and laughter of streams, and miles of May, and by the time the sword was black, it was all enchanted with magic. I gotta say, this is pretty evocative language. I think I'm gonna be in for a good time. Nobody can tell you about that sword all that there is to be told of it, for those that know of those paths of space on which its metals once floated, till Earth caught them one by one, as she sailed past on her orbit, have little time to waste on such things as magic, and so cannot tell you how the sword was made. And those who know whence poetry is, and the need that man has for song, or know of any other 50 branches of magic, have little time to waste on such things as science, and so cannot tell you whence its ingredients came. Enough that it was once beyond our earth, and was now here amongst our mundane stones, that it was once but as those stones, and now had something in it such as soft music has. Let those that can define it. And now the witch drew the black blade forth by the hilt, which was thick and on one side rounded, for she had cut a small groove in the soil below the hilt for this purpose, and began to sharpen both sides of the sword by rubbing them with a curious greenish stone, still singing over the sword an eerie song. Alveric watched her in silence, wondering, not counting time. It may have been for moments, it may have been while the stars went far on their courses. Suddenly she was finished. She stood up with the sword lying on both her hands. She stretched it out curtly to Alveric. He took it. She turned away, and there was a look in her eyes as though she would have kept that sword or kept Alveric. He turned to pour out his thanks, but she was gone. He rapped on the door of the dark house. He called, "Witch! Witch!" along the lonely heath, till children heard on farms and were terrified. Then he turned home, and that was best for him. Chapter 2 in 1 second. Chapter 2. Alveric comes in sight of the Elfland mountains. To the long chamber, sparsely furnished, high in a tower, in which Alveric slept, there came a ray direct from the rising sun. He awoke and remembered at once the magical sword, which made all his awaking joyous. It is natural to feel glad at the thought of a recent gift, but there was also a certain joy in the sword itself, which perhaps could communicate with Alveric's thoughts, all the more easily just as they came from Dreamland, which was preeminently the sword's own country. But, however it be, all those that have come by a magical sword have always felt that joy, while it still was new, clearly and unmistakably. He had no farewells to make, but thought it better instantly to obey his father's command than to stay to explain why he took upon his adventure a sword that he deemed to be better than the one his father loved. So he stayed not even to eat, but put food in a wallet and slung over him by a strap a bottle of good new leather, not waiting to fill it, for he knew he should meet with streams, and, wearing his father's sword as a sword's commonly worn, he slung the other over his back, with its rough hilt tied near his shoulder, and strode away from the castle and vale of Earl. Of money he took but little, half a handful of copper only, for use in the fields we know, for he knew not what coin or what means of exchange were used on the other side of the frontier of twilight. Now, the vale of Earl was very near to the border beyond which there was none of the fields we know. He climbed the hill and strode over the fields and passed through woods of hazel, and the blue sky shone on him merrily as he went by the way of the fields, and the blue was as bright as by his feet when he came to the woods, for it was the time of the bluebells. He ate and filled his water bottle and traveled all day eastwards, and at evening the mountains of Fairy came floating into view, the color of pale forget-me-nots. As the sun set behind Alveric, he looked at those pale blue mountains to see what color their peaks would astonish the evening, but never a tint they took from the setting sun, whose splendor was gilding all the fields we know. Never a wrinkle faded upon their precipices, never a shadow deepened, and Alveric learned that for nothing that happens there is any change in the enchanted lands. He turned his eyes from their serene pale beauty back to the fields we know, and there, with their gables lifting into the sunlight above deep hedgerows, beautiful with spring, he saw the cottages of earthly men. Past them he walked while the beauty of the evening grew, with songs of birds and scents wandering from flowers, and odors that deepened and deepened, and evening decked herself to receive the evening star. But before that star appeared, the young adventurer found the cottage he sought. For, flapping above its doorway, he saw the sign of the huge brown hide, with outlandish letters in gilt, which proclaimed the dweller below to be a worker in leather. An old man came to the door when Alveric knocked, little and bent with age, and he bent more when Alveric named himself, and the young man asked for a scabbard for his sword, yet said not what sword it was, and they both went into the cottage where the old wife was, by her big fire, and the couple did honor to Alveric. The old man then sat down near his thick table, whose surface shone with smoothness, wherever it was not pitted by little tools that had drilled through pieces of leather all that man's lifetime, and in the times of his fathers. And then he laid the sword upon his knees, and wondered at the roughness of hilt and guard, for they were raw, unworked metal, and at the huge width of the sword. And then he screwed up his eyes and began to think of his trade, and in a while he thought out what must be done, and his wife brought him a fine hide, and he marked it out on 2 pieces as wide as the sword, and a bit wider than that. And any questions he asked concerning that wide, bright sword Alveric somewhat parried, for he wished not to perplex his mind by telling him all that it was. He perplexed that old couple enough a little later when he asked them for lodging for the night, and this they gave him with as many apologies as if it were they that had asked a favor, and gave him a great supper out of their cauldron, in which boiled everything that the old man snared, but nothing that Alveric was able to say prevented them from giving up their bed to him and preparing a heap of skins for their own night's rest by the fire. And after their supper, the old man cut out the 2 wide pieces of leather with a point at the end of each, and began to stitch them together on each side. And then Alveric began to ask him of the way, and the old leather worker spoke of the north and south and west, and even of the northeast. But of east or southeast he spoke never a word. He dwelt near the very edge of the fields we know, yet of any hint of anything lying beyond them he or his wife said nothing. Where Alveric's journey lay upon the morrow, they seemed to think the world ended. and pondering afterwards, in the bed they gave him, all that the old man had said, Alvric sometimes marveled at his ignorance, and yet sometimes wondered if it might have been skill by which those two had avoided all the evening any word of anything lying to the east or southeast of their home. He wondered if, in his early days, the old man might have gone there, but he was unable to even wonder what he had found there, if he had gone. Then Alvric fell asleep, and dreams gave him hints and guesses of the old man's wandering in fairyland, but gave him no better guides than he had already. And these were the pale blue peaks of the Elfland mountains. The old man woke him after he had slept long. When he came to the day room, a bright fire was burning there. His breakfast was ready for him, and the scabbard made, which fitted the sword exactly. The old people waited on him silently and took payment for the scabbard, but would not take aught for their hospitality. Silently they watched him rise to go, and followed him without a word to the door, and outside they watched him still, clearly hoping that he would return to the north or west. But when he turned and strode for the Elfland mountains, they watched him no more, for their faces never were turned that way. And though they watched him no longer, yet he waved his hand in farewell. For he had a feeling for the cottages and fields of these simple folk, such as they had not for the enchanted lands. He walked in the sparkling morning through the scenes familiar from infancy. He saw the ruddy orchids, flowering early, reminding the bluebells that they were just past their prime. The small young leaves of the oak were yet a brownish yellow, and the new beech leaves shone like brass, where the cuckoo was calling clearly, and a birch tree looked like a wild woodland creature that had draped herself in a green gauze. On favored bushes were there buds of May. Alvric said over and over to himself farewell to all these things. The cuckoo went on calling, and not for him. And then as he pushed through the hedge into a field unattended, there suddenly close before him in the field was, as his father had told, the frontier of twilight. It stretched across the fields in front of him, blue and dense like water, and things seen through it seemed misshapen and shining. He looked back once over the fields we know. The cuckoo went on calling unconcernedly. A small bird sang about its own affairs, and nothing seemed to answer or heed his farewells. Alvric strode on boldly into those long masses of twilight. A man in a field not far was calling to horses. There were folk talking in the neighboring lane, as Alvric stepped into the rampart of twilight. At once all these sounds grew dim, humming faintly as from great distances. In a few strides he was through, and not a murmur at all came then from the fields we know. The fields through which he had come had suddenly ended. There was no trace of its hedges, bright with new green. He looked back, and the frontier seemed lowering, cloudy and smoky. He looked all around, and saw no familiar thing. In the place of the beauty of May were the wonders and splendors of Elfland. The pale blue mountains stood august in their glory, shimmering and rippling in a golden light that seemed as though it rhythmically poured from the peaks and flooded all those slopes with breezes of gold. And below them, far off as yet, he saw going up all silver into the air the spires of the palace only told of in song. He was on a plain on which the flowers were queer, and the shape of the trees monstrous. He started at once toward the silver spires. To those who may have wisely kept their fancies within the boundaries of the fields, we know it is difficult for me to tell of the land to which Alvric had come, so that in their minds they can see that plain with its scattered trees and far-off dark wood, out of which the palace of Elfland lifted those glittering spires, and above them and beyond them that serene range of mountains whose pinnacles took no color from any light we see. Yet it is for this very purpose that our fancies travel far, and if my reader, through fault of mine, fail to picture the peaks of Elfland, my fancy had better have stayed in the fields we know. Know then that in Elfland are colors more deep than are in our fields, and the very air there glows with so deep a lucency that all things seen there have something of the look of our trees and flowers in June reflected in the water. And the color of Elfland, of which I despaired to tell, may yet be told, for we have hints of it here, the deep blue of the night in summer, just as the gloaming has gone, the pale blue of Venus flooding the evening with light, the deeps of lakes in the twilight. All these are hints of that color, and while our sunflowers carefully turn to the sun, some forefather of the rhododendrons must have turned a little towards Elfland, so that some of that glory dwells with them to this day. And above all, our painters have had many a glimpse of that country, so that sometimes in pictures we see a glamour too wonderful for our fields. It is a memory of theirs that intruded from some old glimpse of the pale blue mountains while they sat at easels painting the fields we know. So Alvric strode on through the luminous air of that land whose glimpses dimly remembered our inspirations here, and at once he felt less lonely. For there is a barrier in the fields we know, drawn sharply between men and all other life, so that if we but a day away from our kind, we are lonely. But once across the boundary of twilight, and Alvric saw this barrier was down. Crows walking on the moor looked whimsically at him. All manner of little creatures peered curiously to see who was come from a quarter whence so few ever came, to see who went on a journey whence so few ever returned. For the king of Elfland guarded his daughter well, as Alvric knew, although he knew not how. There was a merry sparkle of interest in all those little eyes, and a look that might mean warning. There was perhaps less mystery here than on our side of the boundary of twilight, for nothing lurked or seemed to lurk behind great boles of oak, as in certain lights and seasons things may lurk in the fields we know. No strangeness hid on the far side of ridges, nothing haunted deep woods. Whatever might possibly lurk was clearly there to be seen. Whatever strangeness might be was spread in full sight of the traveler. Whatever might haunt deep woods lived there in the open day. And so strong lay the enchantment deep over all that land, that not only did beasts and men guess each other's meanings well, but there seemed to be an understanding even, that reached from men to trees and from trees to men. Lonely pine trees that Alvric passed now and then on the moor, their trunks glowing always with ruddy light that they had got by magic from some old sunset, seemed to stand with their branches akimbo and lean over a little to look at him. It seemed almost as though they had not always been trees, before enchantment had overtaken them there. It seemed they would tell him something. But Alvric heeded no warnings either from beasts or trees, and strode away towards the enchanted wood. That is the end of that chapter. Chapter 3. The Magical Sword Meets Some of the Swords of Elfland. When Alvric came to the enchanted wood, the light in which Elfland glowed had neither grown nor dwindled, and he saw that it came from no radiance that shines in the fields we know, unless the wandering lights of wonderful moments that sometimes astonish our fields, and are gone the instant they come, are strayed over the border of Elfland by some momentary disorder of magic. Neither sun nor moon made the light of that enchanted day. A line of pine trees, up which ivy climbed as high as their lowering black foliage, stood like sentinels at the edge of the wood. The silver spires were shining as though it were they that made all this azure glow in which Elfland swam. And Alvric, having by now come far into Elfland, and being now before its capital palace, and knowing that Elfland guarded its mysteries well, drew his father's sword before he entered the wood. The other thing still hung on his back, slung in its new scabbard over his left shoulder. And the moment he passed by one of those guardian pine trees, the ivy that lived on it unfastened its tendrils, and rapidly letting itself down, came straight for Alvric, and clutched at his throat. The long, thin sword of his father was just in time. Had it not been drawn, he would have scarcely got it out. So swift was the rush of the ivy. He cut tendril after tendril that grasped at his limbs, as ivy grasps old towers, and still more tendrils came for him, until he severed its main stem between him and the tree. And as he was doing this, he heard a hissing rush behind him, and another had come down from another tree, and was rushing at him with all its leaves spread out. The green thing looked wild and angry as it gripped his left shoulder, as though it would hold it forever. But Alvric severed those tendrils with a blow of his sword, and then fought with the rest while the first one was still alive, but now too short to reach him, and was lashing its branches angrily on the ground. And soon, as the surprise of the attack was over and he had freed himself of the tendrils that had gripped him, Alvric stepped back till the ivy could not reach him, and he could still fight it with his long sword. The ivy crawled back to them to lure Alvric on, and sprang at him when he followed it. But terrible though the grip of ivy is, that was a good sharp sword, and very soon Alvric, all bruised though he was, had so lopped his assailant that it fled back up its tree. Then he stepped back and looked at the wood in the light of his new experience, choosing a way through. He saw at once that in the barrier of pine trees the two in front of him had had their ivy so shortened in the fight that if he went midway between the two, the ivy of neither would be able to reach him. He then stepped forward, but the moment he did so, he noticed one of the pine trees move closer to the other. He knew then that the time was come to draw his magical sword. So he returned his father's sword to the scabbard by his side, drew out the other over his shoulder, and going straight up to the tree that had moved, swept at the ivy as it sprang at him, and the ivy fell all at once to the ground, not lifeless, but a heap of common ivy. And then he gave one blow to the trunk of the tree, and the chip flew out, not larger than a common sword would have made, but the whole tree shuddered, and with that shudder disappeared at once a certain ominous look that the pine had had, and it stood there, an ordinary, unenchanted tree. Then he stepped through the wood with his sword drawn. He had not gone many paces when he heard behind him a sound like a faint breeze in the treetops, yet no wind was blowing in that wood at all. He looked round, therefore, and saw that the pine trees were following him. They were coming slowly after him, keeping well out of the way of his sword, but to left and right they were gaining on him, so that he saw he was being gradually shut in by a crescent that grew thicker and thicker as it crowded amongst the trees that it met along the way, and would soon crush him to death. Alveric saw at once that to turn back would be fatal, and decided to push right on, relying chiefly on speed, for his quick perception had already noticed something slow about the magic that swayed the wood, as though whoever controlled it were old or weary of magic, or interrupted by other things. So he went straight ahead, hitting every tree in his way, whether enchanted or not, a blow with his magical sword, and the runes that ran in that metal from the other side of the sun were stronger than any spells that there were in the wood. Great oak trees with sinister boles drooped and lost all their enchantment as Alveric flashed past them with a flick of that magical sword. He was marching faster than the clumsy pines, and soon he left that weird and eerie wood, a wake of trees that were wholly unenchanted, that stood there now without a hint of romance, or mystery even. And all of a sudden he came from the gloom of the wood to the emerald glory of the Elf King's lawns. Again we have hints of such things here. Imagine lawns of ours just emerging from night, flashing early lights from their dewdrops when all the stars have gone, bordered with flowers that just begin to appear, their gentle colors all coming back after night, untrodden by any feet except the tiniest and wildest, shut off from the wind and the world by trees in whose fronds is still darkness. Picture these waiting for the birds to sing. There is almost a hint there sometimes of the glow of the lawns of Elfland, but then it passes so quickly that we can never be sure. More beautiful than aught our wonder guesses, more than our hearts have hoped, were the dewdrop lights and twilights in which these lawns glowed and shone, and we have another thing by which to hint of them, those seaweeds or sea mosses that drape Mediterranean rocks and shine out of the blue-green water for gazers from dizzy cliffs. More like seafloors were these lawns than like any land of ours, for the air in Elfland is thus deep and blue. At the beauty of these lawns Alveric stood gazing as they shone through twilight and dew, surrounded by the mauve and ruddy glory of the massed flowers of Elfland, beside which our sunsets pale and our orchids droop, and beyond them lay like night the magical wood. And jutting from that wood, with glittering portals all open wide to the lawns, with windows more blue than our sky on summer's nights, as though built of starlight, shone that palace that may be only told of in song. As Alveric stood there with his sword in his hand, at the wood's edge scarcely breathing, with his eyes looking over the lawns, at the chiefest glory of Elfland, through one of the portals alone came the king of Elfland's daughter. She walked dazzling to the lawns without seeing Alveric. Her feet brushed through the dew and the heavy air and gently pressed for an instant in the emerald glass, which bent and rose as our harebells when blue butterflies light and leave them, roaming carefree along the hills of chalk. And as she passed he neither breathed nor moved, nor could he have moved if those pines had still pursued him, but they stayed in the forest, not daring to touch those lawns. She wore a crown that seemed to be carved of great pale sapphires. She shone on those lawns and gardens like a dawn coming unaware, out of a long night on some planet nearer than us to the sun. And as she passed near Alveric, she suddenly turned her head, and her eyes opened in a little wonder. She had never before seen a man from the fields we know. And Alveric gazed in her eyes, all speechless and powerless still. It was indeed the Princess Lyrazel in her beauty, and then he saw that her crown was not of sapphires, but ice. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice had the music that of earthly things was most like ice in thousands of broken tiny pieces, rocked by a wind of spring upon lakes in some northern country. And he said, "I come from the fields that are mapped and known." And then she sighed for a moment for those fields, for she had heard how life beautifully passes there, and how there are always in those fields young generations, and she thought of the changing seasons and the children and age of which elfin minstrels had sung when they were told of earth. And when he saw her sigh for the fields we know, He told her somewhat of that land whence he had come. And she questioned him further, and soon he was telling her tales of his home and the Vale of Earl, and she wondered to hear of it, and asked him many questions more, and then he told her all that he knew of Earth, not presuming to tell Earth's story from what his own eyes had seen in his bare score of years, but telling those tales and fables of the way beasts and men, and that the folk of Earl had drawn out of the ages, and which their elders told by the fire at evening when the children asked of what happened long ago. Thus on the edge of those lawns, whose miraculous glory was framed by flowers we have ever known, with the magical wood behind them, and that palace shining near which may only be told of in song, they spoke of the simplest wisdom of old men and old women, telling of harvests and the blossoming of roses and May, of when to plant in gardens, of what wild animals knew, how to heal, how to sow, how to thatch, and of which of the winds and what seasons blow over the fields we know. And then there appeared those knights who guard that palace, lest any should come through the enchanted wood. 4 of them they came, shining over the lawns in armor, their faces not to be seen. In all the enchanted centuries of their lives they had not dared to dream of the princess. They had never bared their faces when they knelt armed before her. Yet they had sworn an oath of dreadful words that no man else should ever speak with her. If one should come through the enchanted wood with this oath now on their lips, they marched towards Alveric. Lyrazel looked at them sorrowfully, yet could not halt them, for they came by command of her father, which she could not avert. And well she knew that her father might not recall his command, for he had uttered it ages ago at the bidding of fate. Alveric looked at their armor, which seemed to be brighter than any metal of ours, as though it came from one of those buttresses near, which are only told of in song. Then he went towards them drawing his father's sword, for he thought to drive its slender point through some joint of the armor. The other he put into his left hand. As the first knight struck, Alveric parried, and stopped the blow, but there came a shock like lightning into his arm, and the sword flew from his hands, and he knew that no earthly sword could meet the weapons of Elfland, and took the magical sword in his right hand. With this he parried the strokes of Princess Lyrazel's guard, for such these 4 knights were, having waited for this occasion through all the ages of Elfland. And no more shock came to him from any of those swords, but only a vibration in his own sword's metal that passed through it like a song, and a kind of a glow that arose in it, reaching to Alveric's heart and cheering it. But as Alveric continued to parry the swift blows of the guard, that sword that was kin to the lightning grew weary of these defenses, for it had in its essence speed and desperate journeys, and lifting Alveric's hand along with it, it swept blows at the elvish knights, and the armor of the Elfland could not hold it out. Thick and curious blood began to pour through the rifts in the armor, and soon of that glittering company 2 were fallen, and Alveric, encouraged by the zeal of his sword, fought cheerily, and soon overthrew another, so that only he and one of the guard remained, who seemed to have some stronger magic about him than had been given to his fallen comrades. And so it was, for when the Elf King had first enchanted the guard, he charmed this elvish soldier first of all, while all the wonder of his runes were new, and the soldier in his armor and his sword had something still of this early magic about them, more potent than any inspirations of wizardry that had come later from his master's mind. Yet this knight, as Alveric soon was able to feel along his arm and his sword, had none of those 3 master runes of which the old witch had spoken when she made the sword on her hill, for these were preserved unuttered by the king of Elfland himself, with which to hedge his own presence. To have known of their existence, she must have flown by broom to Elfland, and spoken secretly alone with the king. And the sword that had visited earth from so far away smote like the falling of thunderbolts, and green sparks rose from the armor, and crimson as sword met sword, and thick elvish blood moved slowly from wide slits down the cuirass, and Lyrazel gazed in awe and wonder and love, and the combatants edged away, fighting into the forest, and branches fell on them, hacked off by their fight, and the runes in Alveric's far-travelled sword exulted and roared at the elf knight, until in the dark of the wood amongst the branches severed from the disenchanted trees, with a blow like that of thunderbolt riving an oak tree, Alveric slew him. At that crash and at that silence, Lyrazel ran to his side. "Quick," she said, "for my father has 3 runes." She durst not speak of them. "Whither?" said Alveric, and she said, "To the fields you know." Yeah, so far, I'm loving this. So this is exciting. An interesting thing, though, I had just previously before this read 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, and there's many areas in which that feels of a continual fields of conversation with it. But I do like this idea, this witch-made sword from thunderbolts, or lightning bolts, that has this magic runes about it, that can only withstand, that is able to withstand the elven strikes and attacks and knights. That all kinds of cool stuff. This is going to be a fun read. But I digress. Let's get another chapter and see where we are. Chapter 4. Alveric comes back to Earth after many years. Back through the guarding wood went Alveric and Lyrazel, she only looking once more at those flowers and lawns, seen only by the furthest travelling fancies of poets in deep sleep, then urging Alveric on, he choosing the way past trees he had disenchanted. And she would not let him delay even to choose his path, but kept urging him away from the palace that is only told of in song. And the other trees began to come lumbering towards them, from beyond the lustreless, unromantic line that Alveric's sword had smitten, looking queerly as they came at their stricken comrades, whose listless branches drooped without magic or mystery. And as the moving trees came nearer, Lyrazel would hold up her hand, and they all halted, and came no more, and still she urged upon Alveric to hasten. She knew her father would climb the brazen stairs of one of those silver spires. She knew he would soon come out onto a high balcony. She knew what rune he would chant. She heard the sound of his footsteps ascending, ringing now through the wood. They fled over the plain beyond the wood, all through the blue everlasting elfin day, and again she looked over her shoulder and urged Alveric on. The Elf King's feet boomed slow on the 1,000 brazen steps, and she hoped to reach the barrier of twilight, which on that side was smoky and dull, when suddenly, as she looked for the 100th time at the distant balconies of the glimmering spires, she saw a door begin to open high up above the palace only told of in song. She cried, "Alas!" to Alveric, but at that moment the scent of briar roses came drifting to them from the fields we know. Alveric knew not fatigue, for he was young, nor she, for she was ageless. They rushed forward, he taking her hand. The Elf King lifted his beard, and just as he began to intone a rune that only once may be uttered, against which nothing from our fields can avail, they were through the frontier of twilight, and the rune shook and troubled those lands in which Lyrazel walked no longer. When Lyrazel looked upon the fields we know, as strange to her as they once have been to us, their beauty delighted her. She laughed to see the haystacks and loved their quaintness. A lark was singing, and Lyrazel spoke to it, and the lark seemed not to understand, but she turned to the other glories of our fields, for all were new to her, and forgot the lark. It was curiously no longer the season of bluebells, for all the foxgloves were blooming, and the May was gone, and the wild roses were there. Alveric never understood this. It was early morning, and the sun was shining, giving soft colors to our fields, and Lyrazel rejoiced in those fields of ours at more common things than one might believe there were among the familiar sights of earth's every day. So glad was she, so gay, with her cries of surprise and her laughter, that there seemed thenceforth to Alveric a beauty that he had never dreamed of in buttercups, and a humor in carts that he never had thought of before. Each moment she found with a cry of joyous discovery some treasure of earth that he had not known to be fair, and then as he watched her bringing a beauty to our fields more delicate, even than that the wild roses brought, he saw that her crown of ice had melted away. And thus she came from the palace that may only be told of in song, over the fields of which I need not tell, for they were the familiar fields of earth. The ages changed but little, and only for a while, and came at evening with Alveric to his home. All was changed in the castle of Earl. In the gateway they met a guardian whom Alveric knew. The man wondered to see them. In the hall and upon the stairway they met some that tended the castle, who turned their heads in surprise. Alveric knew them also, but all were older, and he saw that quite 10 years must have passed away during that one blue day he had spent in Elfland. Who does not know that this is the way of Elfland? And yet who would not be surprised if they saw it happen as Alveric saw it now? He turned to Lyrazel and told her how 10 or 12 years were gone. But it was as though a humble man who had wed an earthly princess should tell her he had lost sixpence. Time had no value or meaning to Lyrazel, and she was untroubled to hear of the lost 10 years. She did not dream what time means to us here. They told Alveric that his father was long since dead, and one told him how he died happy, without impatience, trusting to Alveric to accomplish his bidding, for he had known somewhat of the ways of Elfland, and knew that those that traffic twixt there and there must have something of that calm in which Elfland forever dreams. Up the valley, ringing late, they heard the blacksmith's work. This blacksmith was he who had been the spokesman of those who went once to the long red room of the Lord of Earl. And all these men yet lived, for time though it moved over the Vale of Earl, as over all fields we know, moved gently, not as in our cities. Thence Alveric and Lyrazel went to the holy place of the Freer, and when they found him, Alveric asked the Freer to wed them with Christendom rites. And when the Freer saw the beauty of Lyrazel flash mid the common things in his little holy place, for he had ornamented the walls of his house with knickknacks that he sometimes brought at the friar's, he feared at once she was of no mortal line. And when he asked her whence she came, and she happily answered, Elfland, the good man clasped his hands and told her earnestly how all in that land dwelt beyond salvation. But she smiled, for while in Elfland she had always been idly happy, and now she only cared for Alveric. The Freer went then to his books to see what should be done. For a long while he read in silence, but for his breathing, while Alveric and Lyrazel stood before him, and at last he found in his book a form of service for the wedding of a mermaid that had forsaken the sea, though the good book told not of Elfland. And this, he said, would suffice, for that mermaids dwelt equally with the elf folk beyond the thought of salvation. So he sent for his bell, and such tapers as are necessary. Then turning to Lyrazel, he bade her forsake and forswear, and solemnly to renounce all things pertaining to Elfland, reading slowly out of a book the words to be used on this wholesome occasion. Good Freer, Lyrazel answered, naught said in these fields can cross the barrier of Elfland, and well that this is so, for my father has 3 runes that could blast this book when he answered one of its spells. Were any word able to pass through the frontier of twilight, I will spell no spells with my father. But I cannot wed Christendom man, the Freer replied, with one of the stubborn who dwell beyond salvation. Then Alveric implored her, and she said Then Alveric implored her, and she said the say in the book. Though my father could blast this spell, she added, if it ever crossed some of his ruins. And the bell being now brought, and the tapers, the good man wedded them in his little house, with the rites that are proper for the wedding of a mermaid that has forsaken the sea. I wasn't expecting that to happen so quick, to be honest. You hear something like the King of Elfland's daughter, and you read the beginnings of this where someone, I'm going to Elfland to get a bride. And within 5 chapters, it's happened. But funny, it is interesting that they reference mermaid forsaking the sea. What year is this? 1924. Huh. I'll have to look into that later, but that feels referential to The Little Mermaid, but it may be at a different time. You know, may as well while we're here. Let's look it up. The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid. The original story. Let's take a look at that. Let's see. Originally published in 1837. So yeah, Dunsany is possibly thinking of that. But fascinating. Fascinating that the Freer is like, how do I marry an elf maiden and a man? I guess we'll use mermaids as the example. Anyway, let's jump to the next chapter. Chapter 5, The Wisdom of the Parliament of Earl. In those bridal days, the men of Earl came often to the castle, bringing gifts and felicitations, and in the evenings they would talk in their horses of the fair things that they hoped for the Vale of Earl, on account of the wisdom of the thing they had done when they spoke with the old lord in his long red room. There was Gnarl, the blacksmith, who had been their leader. There was Guhic, who first had thought of it, after speaking with his wife. An upland farmer of clover pastures near an upland farmer of clover pastures near Earl. There was Nihik, a driver of horses. There were 4 vendors of beeves, and Oth, a hunter of deer, and Vlel, the master plowman. All these and 3 men more had gone to the Lord of Earl, and made that request that had set Alveric on his wanderings. And now they spoke of all the good that would come of it. They had all desired that the Vale of Earl should be known among men, as was, they felt, its desert. Its desert, sorry. They had looked in histories, and they had read books treating of pasture, yet seldom found mention at all of the vale they loved. And one day Guhic had said, "Let all us people be ruled in the future by a magic lord, and he shall make the name of the valley famous, and there shall be none that have heard not the name of Earl." And all had rejoiced, and had made parliament, and had gone 12 men to the Lord of Earl, and it had been as I have told. So now they spoke over their mead of the future of Earl, and its place among other valleys, and of the reputation that it should have in the world. They would meet and take in the great forge of Gnarl, and Gnarl would bring them mead from an inner room, and Threll would come in late from his work in the woods. The mead was of clover honey, heavy and sweet, and when they had sat a while in the warm room talking of daily things of the valley and uplands, they would turn their minds to the future, seeing as through a golden mist the glory of Earl. One praised the beeves, another the horses, another the good soil, and all looked to the time when other lands should know the great mastery among valleys that was held by the valley of Earl. And time that brought these evenings bore them away, moving over the vale of Earl as over all fields we know. And it was spring again, and the season of bluebells, and one day in the prime of the wild anemones it was told that Alveric and Lyrazel had a son. Then all the people of Earl lit a fire next night on the hill, and danced about it, and drank mead, and rejoiced. All day they had dragged logs and branches for it from a wild wood near, and the glow of the fire was seen in other lands. Only on the pale blue peaks of the mountains of Elfland no gleam of it shone, for they are unchanged by aught that can happen here. And when they rested from dancing round their fires, they would sit on the ground and foretell the fortune of Earl, when it should be ruled over by this son of Alveric, with all the magic he would have from his mother. And some said that he would lead them to war, and some said to deeper ploughing, and all foretold a better price for their beeves. None slept at night for the dancing and the foretelling a glorious future, and for rejoicing at the things they foretold. And above all they rejoiced that the name of Earl should be thenceforth known and honoured in other lands. Then Alveric sought for a nurse for his child, all through the valley and uplands, and not easily found any worthy of having the care of one that was of the royal line of Elfland. And those that he found were frightened of the light, as though not of our earth or sky, that seemed to shine at times in the baby's eyes. And in the end he went one windy morning up the hill of the lonely witch, and found her sitting idly by her doorway, having nothing to curse or to bless. "Well," said the witch, "did the sword bring you fortune?" "Who knows," said Alveric, "what brings fortune, since we cannot see the end?" And he spoke wearily, for he was weary with age, and never knew how many years had gone over him on the day he travelled to Elfland. Far more it seemed than he had passed on that same day over Earl. "Aye," said the witch, "who knows the end but we?" "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "I wedded the king of Elfland's daughter." "That was a great advancement," said the old witch. "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "we have a child, and who shall care for him?" "Ah, no human task," said the witch. "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "will you come to the Vale of Earl, and care for him, and be the nurse at the castle? For none but you in all these fields know aught of the things of Elfland, except the princess, and she knows nothing of earth." And the old witch answered, "For the sake of the king I will come." So the witch came down from the hill with a bundle of queer belongings, and thus the child was nursed in the fields we know by one who knew songs and tales of his mother's country. And often as they bent together over the baby, that aged witch and the Princess Lyrazel would talk together, and afterwards through long evenings, of things about which Alveric knew nothing. And for all the age of the witch, and the wisdom that she had stored in her 100 years, which is all hidden from man, it was nevertheless she who learned when they talked together, and the Princess Lyrazel who taught. But of earth and the ways of earth, Lyrazel never knew anything. And this old witch that watched over the baby so tended him and so soothed that in all his infancy he never wept. For she had a charm for brightening the morning, and a charm for cheering the day, and a charm for calming the cough, and a charm for making the nursery warm and pleasant and eerie, when the fire leaped up at the sound of it from the logs that she had enchanted, and set large shadows of the things about the fire quivering dark and merry over the ceiling. And the child was cared for by Lyrazel and the witch, as children are cared for whose mothers are merely human. But he knew tunes and runes besides, that other children hear not in the fields we know. So the old witch moved about the nursery with her black stick, guarding the child with her runes. If a draught on the windy nights shrilled in through some crack, she had a spell to calm it, and a spell to charm the song that the kettle sang, till its melody brought hints of strange news from mist-hidden places. And the child grew to know the mystery of fair far valleys that his eyes had never seen. And at evening she would raise her ebon stick, and standing there before the fire among all the shadows, would enchant them and make them dance for him. And they took all manner of shapes of good and evil, dancing to please the baby, so that he came to the knowledge not only of the things which earth is stored, pigs, trees, camels, crocodiles, wolves, and ducks, good dogs, and the gentle cow, but of the darker things also that men have feared, and the things they have hoped and guessed. Through those evenings the things that had happened, and the creatures that are, passed over the nursery walls, and he grew familiar with the fields we know. And on warm afternoons the witch would carry him through the village, and all the dogs would bark at her eerie figure, but durst not come too close, for a page boy behind her carried the ebon stick. And dogs that know so much, that know how far a man can throw a stone, and if he would beat them, and if he durst not, knew also that this was no ordinary stick. So they kept far away from that queer black stick in the hand of the page, and snarled, and the villagers came out to see, and all were glad when they saw how magical a nurse the young heir had. For here, they said, is the witch Zirundirel, and they declared that she would bring him up amongst the true principles of wizardry, and that in this time there would be magic that would make all their valley famous. And they beat their dogs until they slunk indoors, but the dogs clung to their suspicions still, so that when the men were gone to the forge of Gnarl, and their houses were quiet in the moonlight, and Gnarl's windows glowed, and the mead had gone round, and they talked of the future of Earl, more and more of voices joining in the tale of its coming glory, on soft feet the dogs would come out to the sandy street and howl. And to the high sunny nursery Lyrazel would come, bringing a brightness that the learned witch had not in all her spells, and would sing to her boy those songs that none can sing to us here, for they were learned the other side of the frontier of twilight, and were made by singers all unvexed by time. And for all the marvel that there was in those songs, whose origin was so far from the fields we know, and in times remote from those that historians use, and though men wondered at the strangeness of them, when from open casements through the summer days they drifted over Earl, yet none wondered even at those, as she wondered at the earthly ways of her child, and all the little human beings that he did more and more as he grew. For all human ways were strange to her, and yet she loved him more than her father's realm, or the glittering centuries of her ageless youth, or the palace that may be told of only in song. In those days Alvric learned that she would never now grow familiar with earthly things, never understand the folk that dwelt in the valley, never read wise books without laughter, never care for earthly ways, never feel more at ease in the castle of Earl than any woodland thing that Thrall might have snared and kept caged in a house. He had hoped that soon she would learn the things that were strange to her, till the little differences that there are between things in our fields and the Elfland should not trouble her any more. But he saw at last that the things that were strange would always so remain, and that all the centuries of her timeless home had not so lightly shaped her, thoughts and fancies that they could not be altered by our brief years here. When he had learned this, he had learned the truth. Between the spirits of Alvric and Lyrazel lay all the distance there is between earth and Elfland, and love bridged the distance, which can bridge further than that. Yet when for a moment on the golden bridge he would pause and let his thoughts look down at the gulf, all his mind would grow giddy, and Alvric trembled. What of the end, he thought, and feared lest it should be stranger than the beginning. And she did not see that she should know anything. Was not her beauty enough? Had not a lover come at last to those lawns that shone by the palace only told of in song, and rescued her from her uncompanioned fate, and from that perpetual calm? Was it not enough that he had come? Must she needs understand the curious things folk did? Must she never dance in the road, never speak to goats, never laugh at funerals, never singing at night? Why? What was joy, for if it must be hidden? Must merriment bow to dullness in these strange fields she had come to? And then one day she saw how a woman of Earl looked less fair than she had looked a year ago. Little enough was the change, but her swift eye saw it surely, and she went to Alvric crying to be comforted, because she feared that time in the fields we know might have the power to harm that beauty that long ages of Elfland had never dared to dim. And Alveric had said that time must have his way, as all men know. And where was the good of complaining? That's a good place to stop for now. As we come to the hour mark, we end this on chapter 6, or we'll begin next time on chapter 6, The Rune of the Elf King, which is on page 38. A couple things. I was not expecting so much time to pass in so few chapters. I do like that, though. But it is interesting that age is finally being noticed. I've been told it's worth reading through this book and studying it if I want to understand elfkind as it's depicted in tabletop. And I'm starting to understand that there's an interesting depiction here. And this book seems to play a little with time and timelessness. And I'm very curious to see where this goes. I don't have a whole lot other than that, but as far as a blind read goes, I'm excited to see what comes of this, what comes with the child and his training and upbringing by the witch, and in time, Alveric is will die. He'll die before Lyrazel. So I'm very curious to see what happens with that, and yeah, I'm gonna leave that here, and probably no more streams or videos this week, but next week, hopefully back by Tuesday to read more of this. I'm excited to see what happens, and I hope you are too, and I hope you give it a chance. Once again, it's the Ballantine Books copy of The King of Elfland's Daughter, which is pictured, and we will be picking back up on page 38. So, farewell. If I can find the end of this